Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to continue on with the French Revolution, and we're going to be looking at our second section, second phase of the revolution, and this is the radical phase of the revolution. Okay, so it's part 2 of 4, and our question is going to be, how did the Jacobins use issues of class and national sovereignty to seize power during the radical phase of the revolution? So we're going to be looking at these two concepts. Now, as you recall from last section, the estate system had been done away with. So everybody was equal before the law, but this doesn't mean that everybody was exactly equal in all ways, because without the estate system, there was still differences. People were still categorized, stratified, however you want to call it. But they were now stratified according to class, according to how much wealth they had. And so we're going to see that a group called the Jacobins are going to be able to use this to their advantage to gain power. And we're also going to see this idea of national sovereignty. And this is the idea of who is the true spokesman of the people. And so let's look at this, and we're going to start with this idea of national sovereignty. Who are the people? Well, it's important to remember that this idea of the nation didn't exist in the Middle Ages. There was really no concept of the nation as we would understand it today. It really is born out of this time period and the time period just after it. And it's closely tied to the rise of the modern state. All right. And so we saw countries like England and France and Spain and a few others had established themselves as states. And this idea of being French is really born out of this idea of the state. Prior to this, you remember in a previous lecture, we talked about the way people identified previously, and it was much more localized. So oftentimes, people would identify as members of a particular locality, maybe a manor. Okay, so if you ask people in the Middle Ages, well, what are you? Where are you from? If they understood the question at all, they most likely would have said something like, "Oh, I'm from such and such a manor. That's what I am," or "I'm from such and such a city. That's what I am." Some people, if you belong to a religious establishment, you may have identified with that particular religious establishment. If you said, "Well, what are you?" You might have said, "Well, I'm a Franciscan," or "I'm a Dominican," or something to that degree. Okay, and so the idea of the nation is closely tied to the idea of the state. Now, as far as who should represent the nation once it's founded, early on, kings assumed that they were the representatives of the state, of the nation. And so our friend Louis XIV here, one of his quotes was "L'état c'est moi," which is probably horribly mispronounced, but it means something like, "I am the state. The state is me." All right. And so this was an early idea under absolutism, that the king was the representative of the nation. He embodied the nation himself. Well, this idea maybe in the court was widely accepted, but not everybody accepted it. And the nobility always felt that it was more the representative of the state, more the representative of the nation. You know, they claimed ancient pedigree, ancient privilege, that somehow they were the true representatives of the nation. Now, we saw at this time, just prior to the French Revolution, that the nobility was increasingly assertive and really claiming its prerogatives. We saw them actually lead the revolution in some ways by revolting against the king and demanding the calling of the Estates General. Of course, when the Estates General was called and the different representatives assembled, we saw that certain members of the third estate claimed that no, they were in fact the real representatives of the nation, particularly the bourgeoisie. They said, well, we're the delegates that are here to represent the third estate. The third estate makes up 95% of the nation. We are the true representatives of the people. We are the representatives of the nation. Okay? And so we saw that. All right. Well, as the National Assembly met and as they were finally elected, when the delegates sat down, they realized that, even though most of them had been elected and were sitting there, that they had some real differences among them. Okay? Most of them were members of the third estate. A couple of nobles had been elected, but these were all members of the third estate. But there was quite a bit of political difference between them. Anytime you get a group of people together, they're going to be differences. And so they began to divide based on how conservative or how radical they were. Now, I realize this slide's a little bit hard to see. Again, as I've said, oftentimes the uploading it onto this voice thread, the slides get a little messed up, but hopefully you can see that there's a word right written in there to the right side of your screen. And the right, of course, in modern politics means conservative, and this idea really comes from the time of the French Revolution. The more conservative members tended to sit on the right of the Speaker of the National Assembly. You'll see a guy in the middle there at a table. That was the Speaker. And more conservative members tended to congregate together. People who saw thought alike tend to sit together. And so they tend to sit on the right. And that's where really this term comes from. Now, for these members, some of the members who were elected thought that the revolution had gone too far. And they kind of wanted to walk it back a little bit. All right. Some of them said, well, the king is the rightful ruler of France, and we need to restore the monarchy back to its original position, maybe with a few modifications, but constitutional monarchy, not a great idea. Many of these members on the right, the more conservative members, were more religious. They were bigger advocates of the Roman Catholic Church. And as you'll recall from our last lecture, the church had been stripped of much of its powers. And these people said the church needs to be put back to its original position. All right? We need to walk the revolution back. It's gone too far. Another thing that many of these more conservative members also disagreed with was the fact that privilege had been done away with. Many of these members thought that nobility was a good and a natural part of society, and that it had been wrong to disband this ancient tradition of having a nobility and making everybody equal. So these were the more conservative members. Now, in some ways, they represented big parts of the country. There were big parts of the country that were pretty hostile to the revolution. People in the countryside, in particular, were pretty hostile. Now, a major group in the country that was very hostile was the Roman Catholic Church. I mentioned last time that priests had to swear an oath of loyalty not to the Pope but to the state. Roughly about half of the priests in France refused to do this. They said, well, in good conscience, our loyalty must be with the Pope. It is not with the state. And so we're going to refuse. Many of the peasants whom these people served also agreed with them. Peasants tend to be pretty conservative. And so they agreed with the priest. They said, yeah, this is wrong. And so big parts of the countryside of France were in a state of rebellion. They said, we're not following the National Assembly. We don't think that this National Assembly represents us. We want the old system back. Another group of people who were downright hostile to the revolution were a group of people called the emigres. And the emigres, well, the English word would be emigrant, not immigrant, but emigrant. In the United States, we're used to immigrants, that's people who come in, but emigrants are people who go out. Now, these emigres were people who had fled the country. And for the most part, they were made up of the nobility. Many nobles during the Great Fear, during the time of the Bastille, realized that things were getting hostile and maybe even dangerous to them. And so they had left the country and gone to France's nearby neighbors, to England, or a lot of them had gone to Prussia or Austria, just over the border. And they were pretty hostile. They wanted their old estates back, and they wanted their old privileges back. And so, these were people who were threatening to invade if they could get any sort of funding or any kind of support. Another group of people who were very far to the right were foreign monarchs. These are the monarchs of some of the neighboring countries, whether in Germany or in Prussia or in Austria. Many of these monarchs were hostile to the revolution. And it wasn't so much because they were, sorry that France was going through trouble. They maybe they liked that, but they realized that the ideas that the French were beginning to advocate could easily be spread to their own countries. Okay? And so if you're the king of Austria or the king of Prussia, you might fear that if this is allowed to go on, maybe your people will want to revolt against you. Also, it's important to remember that the nobility were all, and the kings especially, were all related. Remember, we mentioned Marie Antoinette. She was the cousin of the king of Austria, I believe. And they were cousins. And so, there was maybe a little bit of family loyalty. And so, again, the groups I was describing just a moment ago, they weren't in the National Assembly. They were outside, but in some ways they had representatives inside the National Assembly who did want to walk back the revolution. There were a lot of people in the middle, and hopefully you can see center on the screen there. Again, it's a little faint, but in the middle there's the center, and these were people who were moderates. All right? And they tended to think the revolution was just about right. They were maybe members of the bourgeoisie. If you recall, the bourgeoisie had really triumphed in the revolution. And they said, yeah, no, the constitutional monarchy, that's just about right. We got separation of powers. That's a good thing. They were satisfied with where the voting situation was. Said, yeah, no, it's good that we have the National Assembly here. It's good that we have men of property, men of reason who are voting, and that's a good thing. They said, well, we have a society based on merit here, so if anyone really wants to vote, they can make some more money. They can move up the social ladder, and so it's really open to everybody. We did away with privilege, and it's based on merit. So, that's a good thing, they thought. Said, everybody now is a lot better than it used to be. There's all kinds of personal liberties, freedoms, and so this is a really, really good thing. And so, the upper class and upper middle class, they had a lot of support in the center. But there were a group of people to the left wing, all right? And the left wing were people who thought that the revolution hadn't gone far enough. Now, it's important to remember that the left wing was also bourgeois. Again, you had to be a man of property to sit in the National Assembly, and these were educated people. But there were people who had radical ideas. Now, you may remember um, reading and our discussions on Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Remember, he was a radical philosopher. And if you think about some of the ideas that Rousseau had, is Rousseau believed that sovereignty wasn't in the hands of the king, definitely wasn't in the hands of the nobility, but it wasn't even in the hands of delegates. Rousseau had argued that sovereignty was in the hands of the people. All right. You may also remember that for Rousseau, the people, at least the most virtuous people, tended to be the poor, the peasants, the working class. These were the people who were most in touch with the state of nature. We talked quite a bit about that, and you've read quite a bit about that. And so for Rousseau, who is now dead, by the way, but his writings lived on, um, for Rousseau, it was the common man. They were the real people. All right. And of course, these were the people who had been disenfranchised by the Constitution that had come out of the French Revolution. All right. Remember, the poor weren't allowed to vote. And these radical members of the National Assembly said, well, this isn't right. Real, echoing Rousseau, they said the real people, the nation really is the poor here. And so these members tended to favor a republic. All right. The republic's used in a couple of different ways, but the way they were using it here is they meant a society without a king. All right. And they said, yes, we need a republic, and it should be a democratic republic, kind of the way Rousseau had envisioned it. In other words, the people should vote. The people, every male at least, should have the right to vote. All right. Now, they had allies too, and their allies were people, especially in Paris, people in and around Paris who had been deprived of the right to vote. And so they had strong support in Paris, this left wing. All right. These are people who you may remember had been propagandized. They had been radicalized in some ways during the revolution. All right. Well, having the people of Paris might have been good moral support, but it really did them very little good politically because they couldn't vote. So it really wasn't much of an issue. And so in some ways, the left wing at this, as the assembly opens, looks like the weaker part. But as we're going to see, events were going to favor them. All right, the left wing is going to become stronger. Now, counterintuitively, this has to do with the fact that the right wing was also in a state of revolt. You'll remember that big parts of the countryside were not loyal to the National Assembly, and they were not loyal to the National Assembly mostly because they were conservative. All right. So you get these disaffected priests. You've got the peasants in the countryside who are not happy with things. You have many nobles who are strong in the countryside, and they're not happy with things. And so big parts of the country, as you can see by this image here, are in revolt. They're not accepting the National Assembly as their spokesman. All right. They want they are dissatisfied, and they want the king to go back to being an absolute monarch. All right. And they're actively trying to work against that, for the king and against the National Assembly. Well, in the spring of 1792, things get even more complicated because Austria and Prussia declared war on the revolutionaries. And so they began to send their armies in to invade France. And this was really bad for France because, well, these were professional armies, And most of the generals of France had been nobles, and they were not, um, they were no longer in France. And so at first things went badly. You can imagine the headaches this caused the National Assembly because, not only do you have the French and the Austrians, but you got big parts of France that aren't loyal to you. You get all kinds of traitors within the country who are trying to work against the revolution. Now, the Austrian and the Prussians were aware that the main center of the revolution was Paris. And so they weren't secretive in their desire to really punish Paris. They made it known that when they got to Paris, they were going to clean house. There was going to be a day of reckoning, and they were going to punish the leaders of the revolution and the people of Paris themselves. And so this caused a great deal of consternation. This caused a great deal of trouble in Paris, as the Austrians and the Prussians are getting closer and closer. The armies of the revolution are losing ground. The people of Paris are fearful that when the Austrians and Prussians get there, maybe there will be a bloodbath, a massacre. The National Assembly is fearful. Their lives are on the line here. And so they craft some legislation. They say, well, obviously we need more soldiers. We need stronger troops. And so the National Assembly passes a bill. Pass a bill to raise more troops. And the assembly comes before the king and they say, okay, here's the legislation. We just need you to sign this. And the king vetoes the legislation. Now, politically, the king has the right to do that, right? It's a constitutional monarchy, and one of the powers of the king is to veto. And you may be wondering, well, why did the king veto? His country's being invaded. Well, you got to remember, his sympathies were probably more with the Austrians and the Prussians than it was with the people of the National Assembly or the people of Paris. After all, it was the Austrians and the Prussians who were coming to essentially liberate him. And so maybe it's not so surprising that the king vetoed this particular piece of legislation. Now, this put the moderates in the House of in the National Assembly on the defensive. They had been arguing right along that constitutional monarchy is a good thing. Checks and balances are a good thing. And now, the king has kind of double-crossed them in a sense. And, their position is now looking kind of foolish. And the position that's looking like the intelligent position right now is the left-wing position. They had said, well, no, we need a republic. They had been arguing right along, we need a republic. The king, we can't trust the king, power to the people, right? And so their arguments are looking a lot better right now. And the king didn't help the moderates at all because the king actually tried to flee. 1792, the king, in disguise, tries to leave and tries to get to where the Austrians and the Prussians are. All right? Tries to join up with the emigres and maybe, maybe even lead the army into defeat the revolution. Well, unfortunately for the king, though, he is captured. He almost gets away with it. He almost escapes, but he's recognized and he's captured and he's brought back to Paris. But this time, he's going to be kept under closer scrutiny. And once again, this just proves to many people in the National Assembly that the left-wing position is the more intelligent one. And it proves to the people of Paris that the king is untrustworthy, that the National Assembly, those members who are keeping him in power, are as much to blame as the king is. right? The moderates and the conservatives in the National Assembly, they're just enabling the king, and if and they're they're not loyal to the revolution, and it puts the moderates in a very difficult position, arguing that we need to keep things the way they are. Now, I want to look at the city of Paris a little more closely, and who these major players are in Paris. And so I want to talk about a group of people called the Sans-Culottes. All right. And this is a French word. And what Sans-Culottes literally means is without breeches. And let me explain that a little bit. Now, you may know that in the 1700s, the fashion for upper class men was to wear these little short pants, like you can see on the guy on the left here, and to have silk stockings. All right, so you wear the little short pants and some silk stockings, and that is a sign that you're an upper middle class sort of person. These breeches are called culottes in French. Now, if you were a manual laborer, you could not wear these types of clothes. One, because you probably couldn't afford the silk stockings, and two, because, well, you did heavy labor. You were a laborer, and you needed to have heavier pants on. And so it became kind of synonymous with a class distinction. The working classes wore pants. The upper classes wore the culottes. All right. And so the sans-culottes are the working class of Paris. All right. They're the urban, the proletariat, the guys with the neck tattoos. Well, no, they probably didn't have those yet, but you get the idea. All right. They're the Parisian mob. They were the ones who had been very active in bringing about the revolution, the small shopkeepers, the artisans, the wage earners. They had been the ones who had stormed the Bastille. Their wives had been the ones who had led the Women's March in October, several years earlier. And they'd been very active in the revolution, but as far as they were concerned, the revolution hadn't done anything for them. All right. They hadn't gotten any voting rights. The price of bread was astronomical. They hadn't gotten anything out of it. It had been the bourgeoisie, the upper classes, and the upper middle classes. They had done very well out of this, but the working man had gotten nothing, and so they were a bit bitter. And they were closely allied with radical left-wing bourgeoisie, the members of the National Assembly who were on the left. They tended to socialize together. They tended to go to the same clubs together. And so it's with the support of these radical members of the bourgeoisie that the people of Paris rose up. And they rose up and they overthrew the government of Paris. The government of Paris had been a moderate bourgeoisie government, loyal to the National Assembly. And in the climate of fear, remember, the Austrians and the Prussians are getting closer. The king has been treacherous. The price of bread is astronomical. And in this climate of fear and in hardship, radical members of the National Assembly, with their allies among the poor, among the sans-culottes, rose up and overthrew the government. They seized the government of Paris and they turned it into a commune. Now, you remember this word commune is a word that we've seen before. And I'd like you to think back. Where did we see the word commune? Now, if you recall, several weeks ago, we had talked about the beginnings of the commercial revolution and the first cities. And you remember the first cities, particularly in Italy, were communes. That is, each citizen agreed to defend the others, the lives and the property of all citizens. All citizens bear arms. Hopefully, you remember some of that. Well, essentially, Paris was turned into a commune. Each citizen was going to um, have the right to vote. Each citizen was going to have the to bear arms on behalf of the city. And this group that had taken over was led by a group in the National Assembly called the Jacobins. The Jacobins had reached out to the Sans Culottes, said, listen, the economic conditions are terrible. You guys are the real salt of the earth here. You guys are the real nation here. You should rise up and throw off the shackles and and take over the government. And so under the Jacobin leadership, they had done this. The Jacobins began to drill these men into a type of a national guard for protection. And with the might of these sans-culottes, who, by the way, make up about 80% of the population of Paris. I mean, like from a modern city, right? Maybe the inner core is wealthy or upper class, but there's always a lot more poor people in a city than there are rich people, usually in the suburbs and around the city, just on the outer core. With the muscle of the sans-culottes and the leadership of the Jacobins, they were able to rise up and arrest the king. All right, so they attacked the palace of the king. They arrested the king. The king was put under arrest. The mob then turned its attention against the members of the National Assembly, and particularly the conservative members and the more moderate members of the National Assembly. And they ordered the National Assembly to dissolve itself. They said, this National Assembly does not represent the people. We are the real representatives of the people. We need new elections. We need a new constitution. And we're going to overthrow the government. And so this is kind of like a type of coup d'etat. So we're going to have a new democratically elected government. All male citizens will have the right to vote in this new government. Of course, the National Assembly is terrified. You've got thousands and thousands of armed people outside, and so they capitulated. Well, not only this, but the mob was also fearful that there were a lot of traitors in the city. All right, there were a lot of people who were conservative and maybe loyal to the king, loyal to the church, loyal to the nobility. And so many of these people had been thrown in jail for safety's sake, but the mob attacked and opened up these jails and did some really impromptu trials. Many of these people were tried, and we'll put tried in quotes, and let out to be immediately executed, these conservative Parisians and people who were in jail. And this became known as the September Massacre, all right, killing these prisoners. And this event really sent shockwaves across Europe. As word got out, even people who were sympathetic to the revolution said, well, this is getting very bloody and very dangerous in Paris. The king has been arrested, the assembly is dissolved, and the rabble of Paris is now murdering people. All right, well, sure enough, new elections were held. A new constitution was put into place, and this new group, and again, I apologize for the how light the text is. If you can look on the right, though, you'll see the new Constitutional Convention was called, democratically elected, and again, people break down into groups. And if you'll notice on the right, it says Girodin, Girodin. All right, that's the word that's there. And let me talk a little bit about this. As I said earlier, anytime you get a group of people together, you're going to have differences. And this new body that was elected democratically. Okay. Um, Probably not the fairest elections. There was probably a lot of fear. Many conservatives were probably scared away at the polls. But anyways, this new body was elected. Um, the king was under arrest, and so a republic was proclaimed. So this a couple of firsts here. It's a republic, and it's democratic. All right. The old distinction between those who could vote and those who couldn't, provided you were male and you were French, that wasn't really in place anymore. And the biggest group that won was this Girondin group. Okay. Now it's important to remember that this Girondin was going to become the new conservatives, and we'll put conservative in parentheses because the Girondin had been radical before. All right. They had been the radicals. They had been the ones calling for democracy and a republic, but they were now the conservatives. And really what made them conservative was where they came from. The Girondins were strongest in the countryside. All right. So the areas outside of Paris, they had these delegates. Again, they're the Democrats, they're Republicans, but they are from the countryside, the area outside of Paris. And they tended to be very strong advocates for the free market. They said, well, these are really principles that we can't part with. Economic freedom is something that is a fundamental right, and we do not part with free markets. Another thing that made them conservative was that they tended to distrust the Parisian mob. They were probably happy that the mob had dissolved the National Assembly, but they were wary of them. They said, this isn't really a good precedence. We don't want to rule. We don't want the mob ruling. And so they tended to distrust the citizens of Paris. Another thing that made them conservative is that they were the question was what to do with the king now. And the Girondins said, well, he's under arrest. He can't really do anybody any harm. There's no need to do anything more to him. We'll keep him under arrest. We're already a republic. He's lost his power. He's not harming anybody. Don't want to kill him. Well, their enemies now, former allies, were the Jacobins. All right. And the Jacobins were the delegates who mostly represented Paris. All right. And they were a minority. They were the smaller group in the National Assembly. They represented Paris. Again, most of these people are bourgeoisie. They are educated and they are property owners, but they're the far left. They're the left of the left, I guess we could say. All right. And they wanted to pull the revolution even further to the left. All right. Now, their allies, their strong allies, are the people of Paris, the sans-culottes, and they tended to agree with their constituents to some degree. They tended to agree with the sans-culottes. The most important thing was to get economic relief to the people of Paris. The price of bread was unaffordable. People were starving. And so they said, no, at all costs, what we really need to do is we need to make sure that people eat. And if we have to suspend the free market, then so be it. And so this was the big economic divide was, do we mess with the free market? Do we lower the price of bread, even if it's artificially? Or do we keep to the market, even if that means that the price of bread is going to remain high? They were also much less tolerant of the king. They said, no, the king is a traitor, and the king needs to be executed. All right? And so these are some of the main divides. Again, seemingly the Jacobins are in the weaker position, being in the minority, but the fact that the National Assembly is in Paris is really, an ace in the hole for them. All right. And so, again, it's kind of a class thing because the Girondins are, free market, probably upper class, a little more upper class support, and the Jacobins are really the representatives of this sans culotte. All right. Well, a lot of wrangling goes on in these early months of over what the Constitution's ultimately going to look like, what's going to happen to the king, what the state of the market's going to be. And these two sides go at each other's throats, even though they're former allies, they go at each other's throats throughout the next couple of months. So much so that, there's kind of a stalemate and things are getting worse. Well, finally, using their allies in and around Paris, the Jacobins are able to surround this constitutional convention, this new National Assembly that's been called, and they're able to force the Girondins out of power. All right, they're using this mob violence again. All right, and essentially they seize control. Real power is put into the hands of what's called the Committee of Public Safety. And these are 12 Jacobins who are given almost dictatorial power. All right, it's going to be like a 12-man dictatorship of just Jacobins, and they're going to guide France through these troubled times. Their argument is the National Assembly can't get anything done. The Constitutional Convention is at a stalemate. Nothing is happening. If we leave things the way they are, A, people are going to starve, and B, the Austrians and the Prussians will crush us. And so we need to seize control. And using the sans-culottes, they're able to do that. Now, the leader of this group is a pretty famous guy, and his name is Maximilien de Robespierre. He's the leader of the Committee of Public Safety. All right. And under Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, the Jacobins make good on their promise to their constituents. They institute economic controls. And what they pass is what's called a law of maxims. And what this does is it sets the maximum price of bread. Okay? And so the free market is not going to operate. It's not going to be the market price, the laws of supply and demand. It's going to be a price by dictate. In other words, they're going to set what the maximum price of bread is. And so if you're a grain dealer, you may say, well, there's not a lot of grain right now, and I want to sell this grain at a high price. The law of supply and demand dictates that because I have grain and and there's demand for it, I should be able to set a high price. But of course, the members of the Committee of Public Safety said, no, you can't do that. You have to sell it at such and such a price. If you're a baker, you may say, well, again, I have grain and I should be able to sell this at the price that, the market will support. But no, you can't do that. Or if you're a peasant in the countryside, you may say, we had a great crop this year, but grain is high. I should sell it at such and such a price. But the law was no. It has to be at such and such a price. And for several staple items, this was this is what happened. And so this was a big part of the Jacobins trying to keep the price of bread low. Another thing that the Jacobins did, which was something that the Girondins were uncomfortable with, was seizing property. Okay, so the Jacobins said, listen, there's a lot of emigres out of the country. There's a lot of people who are unloyal to the revolution. And these people need to lose their property, and it should be redistributed. Okay? Another thing that the Jacobins were comfortable doing that others weren't was to tax the wealthy at a higher rate. Again, their constituents are the poor, right? The Jacobins most represent the sans-culottes, and by taxing the rich more heavily, they can help finance the war effort and also begin to bring public assistance. So for the first time, public assistance is given to the very poor and worthy members of the poor. And so this is something new. Okay, the Jacobins are abandoning free market principles. Another thing that the Jacobins are going to do is they're going to engage in total war. Okay, essentially the argument is all French men are now citizens. Okay, you are citizens, and in the same way that all members of the commune support all other members of the commune, now all members of the nation should be eligible to bear arms. We should all look after each other. We're a nation after all. And so conscription was put into place. Conscription is when there's a draft. We're all citizens, and all citizens defend their property. And so if your draft number comes up, you need to come and you need to come out and fight. And so under the Jacobins, the French army gets very, very large. Something like 800,000 men at arms now. So balloons. This is a citizen army. And of course, these men are given patriotic speeches. They're now fighting for the nation. And the Jacobins are also comfortable instituting total war in the sense of putting all of the economic resources, not just all the manpower resources, but also the economic resources that the war effort needs. And so the Jacobins opened state-run factories for bombs and guns and bullets and tents and uniforms, all of those things. If the army needs to eat, then they're comfortable seizing grain to make sure that the army is fed. All resources toward the war. And for the sans-culottes, this is good. They wholeheartedly welcome this. It means jobs in the army or jobs in war factories. It means that, that we're now acting more like a nation. We're more acting like one instead of, being excluded. And so this is all very, very popular with the sans-culottes. Well, the Jacobins find that they have some real problems, though. Not everybody is on board with this. There's a lot of support in Paris and maybe some of the other big cities, but outside of that, a lot of people aren't big fans of this. And so the law of maxims, people flout it. If I'm a baker and the law is I have to sell it at such and such a price, I may try to sell on the black market. I may tell my customers, like, I have no more bread, but if you meet me around back at 7 o'clock after I close for a fee, I'll sell it to you. Or grain dealers. People who buy grain wholesale were maybe hoarding it and waiting for or selling it on the black market. Some peasants were refusing to grow. Well, we just won't sell our grain. We won't plant. We don't want to sell it at these prices. We're not making enough of a profit. Okay, and so the people were openly defiant of this the Jacobins. And so, in order to make this work, the Jacobins started to use what is called the terror. Okay, if you're a peasant and you want to support the priests, or you're refusing to grow grain, then we're going to deal harshly with you. You're going to go to the guillotine. All right, and this was a new invention, the guillotine. Now, it may look like a horrible invention to us, but you have to remember that this was considered to be a humane way to die. It doesn't look humane to us, but you have to remember that previously people were crushed or burned or tortured to death, and this was a quick way to kill people and an efficient way to kill people. And so the Jacobins began to use this against people who they deemed weren't pro-revolutionary enough. Maybe people were hoarding grain, or people who were supportive of the priest or the priests themselves. Many of them went to the guillotine. Many nobles went to the guillotine. All right. Even members of the Girondins, the former allies of the Jacobins, they went to the guillotine in large numbers. And so anybody who wasn't sufficiently revolutionary enough, the Jacobins said, well, they're against the revolution, they have to go. And you remember their hero, who was Rousseau, said, sometimes we need to force our fellow citizens to be free. All right. And so many people, including the king and Marie Antoinette, went to the guillotine during this period of time, the terror. Now, it may not surprise you that many people started to cooperate. Grain dealers stopped hoarding grain. The rebellions in the countryside ceased. The Jacobins were able to use the army to help collect grain and to enforce this. Many peasants went back to producing, and with their large armies, the Jacobins were successful. And so, under the Jacobins, in a lot of ways, things started to become successful. But of course, there was a high price to be paid. I mean, the economy wasn't free. There's this terror going on, and as France started to stabilize, many people started to say, "Well, why are we still executing large numbers of people?" And even among the Committee of Public Safety and among the Jacobins themselves, there was a lot of dispute. Some of the members of the Committee of Public Safety wanted to moderate things a bit. They said, well, we can't go on killing people like this. And maybe, now that the economy is stabilized, price of bread is stabilized, let's try to end this terror. Maybe bring back the free market to some degree. Other members of the Committee of Public Safety said, no. There's still a lot of enemies of the revolution. There's still hoarders out there. The people need to eat more. And so there were members of the Committee of Public Safety who were quasi-communists. They said, listen, there's still too much inequality. We need to do away with all inequality till all Frenchmen are completely equal economically and everything, until all wealth is redistributed. That's what we want. And in the middle was Robespierre, who was increasingly more and more paranoid about both these sides. And so Robespierre even began to execute fellow Jacobins, even members of the Committee of Public Safety who were too far to the right and too far to the left found themselves on the guillotine. And so in this climate of paranoia, many people wondered, well, who's next? Who won't be spared the guillotine? And so some began to secretly plot the overthrow of the Jacobins, of Robespierre, of the Committee of Public Safety. And in 1793, a coup d'etat was launched against Robespierre himself. All right. As he got up to give a speech before the National Assembly, some members were waiting. They had troops ready, and they arrested Robespierre. And Robespierre soon found himself on the guillotine, and leading Jacobins soon followed him. And this government, by the Jacobins, was put to an end. And a more moderate constitution was put into place. And so with the Jacobins fighting among themselves, the enemies rose up and overthrew the Jacobins. And, these were more moderate bourgeoisie types. They were still advocates of a republic. But the democracy part, they said, listen, this democracy thing didn't work. We'll have the sans-culottes, and we had the terror as a result of that, and we need a more moderate government. And so this experiment with democracy was ended. A more moderate government was put into place. The free market was put back into place, and the radical phase of the republic was ended. Okay. And so what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to answer this question. How did the Jacobins use issues of class and this idea of national sovereignty, this idea of who is the real representative of the people, to seize power during the radical phase of the revolution? So answer that question in our discussion board.